Exactly at noon, or 11,
11:11.
a silence fell for the first time in many years over the Western Front. There's a wonderful description of that moment by, of all people, Harry Truman. He was there, he was in a forward position, shooting at the German troops. He was right there on the front line, and he describes it very well in some of his writing. The moment that the guns fell silent, and that suddenly peace came, but as we know, it was a peace of the dead. Oh, never recovered from it in Europe, at least. Okay, now today I'm going to try to get us up to 1900. Try, okay? I'll do my best. Just wanted to read a few comments from various Chinese sources, just kind of setting the mood for the next hour. The distress of the people is due to heavy taxation. Heavy taxation is due to the increase in the armed forces. The increase in the armed forces is due to the number of rebellions, and the rebellions are due to defects in government. Po Chu-yi, 9th century. All right. Heaven is above, earth is below, and that in between heaven and earth is called China. Those on the peripheries are the foreign. The foreign belong to the outer, while China belongs to the inner. Shi Ji, 1040 AD. Right? This is a modern historian. The empire saw itself as the center of the civilized universe. The Chinese scholar bureaucrat did not think of a China or a Chinese civilization in the modern sense. For him, there were the Han people, and beyond that, only barbarians. Whatever was not civilized was by definition barbaric. And that was the view right until, I guess, the end of the 19th century. This is Henry Kissinger in his book on China. China did not export its ideas, but let others come to seek them. Neighboring peoples, the Chinese believed, benefited from contact with China and civilization so long as they acknowledged the suzerainty of the Chinese government. Those who did not were barbarians. The world was divided into the Middle Kingdom, China, the Middle Kingdom, between heaven above and earth below. And those who acknowledged the superiority, the supremacy of Chinese civilization, Chinese art, Chinese science, they were the tributaries. And in proof of that, they came every year, performed the koto, very often received gifts in return that outweighed the benefits of anything they brought. But they acknowledged, so they were the tributary states. They were, in fact, enlightened. Those who did not, everyone beyond the periphery, they were barbarians. And so when the Westerners began to arrive, they were considered barbarians. Okay, one more. Benjamin Willox, 1830. He was a merchant who spent a number of years in China, an American merchant, lived in Philadelphia. You might be interested to know that Philadelphia was the center of the China trade. The first China museum in the United States was opened, I think, at 9th and Spruce. And it was an overwhelming success. A man named Thomas Dunn. He eventually left. He had personal problems with the law, which I won't go into. But he took most of the exhibits to England when he left. But 9th and, I think 9th and Spruce was the original, the first Chinese museum in the US. This is what he said in 1830. I am unhinged, unsettled, idle, and of course irritable. everything here, Philadelphia, loses in competition with China. He was unhinged coming back to Philadelphia. All right. Finally, I've got two more. Ours will no longer be a nation subject to insult and humiliation. We have stood up. Mao Zedong, 1949. And finally, the Geneva Conference, 1954, the end of the Vietnam War. Zhou Enlai, the second in command in China, came as a negotiator. And he was introduced to John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State. And I might mention he came from a family that had been involved in the China trade generations before. And Zhou's lasting memory of the Geneva Conference was going up to John Foster Dulles and extending his hand, and John Foster Dulles refused to take it. Now, he said, later in years, we have broken out of the old pattern. Okay, this is my preliminary, all right? Because I want to go back. But before we do, one of your class members brought along an opium pipe that you might, a Chinese opium pipe that you might be interested in looking at.
This is a
turn around and tell them.
This is a 19th century China opium pipe. Obviously, somebody with money, because it's silver. I don't exactly know how it works. But anyway, this is what, for the wealthy, tried it once. But anyway, this is what the wealthy people smoked their opium in. It wasn't these things you see on television, some falling apart thing. Okay. Thanks so much for the opium.
There's very pretty designs on it as well, but no opium. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to try. I'm going to try to cover the major topics of the 19th century. This is the century of the undoing of China. By the end of the century, 1900, foreign troops are in the capital, the dynasty is broken, the empress has fled, and we've come really, in a sense, not just to, you know, a fall, but the fall of a civilization that dated back over 2,200 years. It was not just a temporary blip, it seemed. It was the fall of a 2,200-year civilization. Now imagine what the extent of that fall must have been. The 19th century was the century of degradation, as they put it. This was the age of, well, as Mao Zedong later said, I don't think I read his, ours will no longer be a nation subject to insult and humiliation. We have stood up. It's a matter of not just a temporary fall of a dynasty to be replaced by another, the same system brought back. It's really the fall, a fall of a total civilization that extended back in time to the year 2500. Imagine if the Roman Empire had lasted until the year 1900, and then it suddenly collapsed. Imagine the extent of that fall. And that's what we're looking at. And we enter into this century, what they call the century of degradation. You know, they never even referred to the Opium Wars as the Opium Wars until about 1900. Did you know that? To them, it was a minor scuffle. They were facing bigger problems internally. Because what you had was an internal crisis that coincided with the external crisis. And that is why the system could not cope, broke down. And you didn't move on to another dynasty, you broke on to a total collapse and a century of upheaval, disorder, experimentation, and so on. But let me go back now to where we left off the last time. They banned opium in China in 1729. So it was a banned substance as far as the Chinese were concerned. The Dutch were the, I guess, the culprits here. They had discovered that mixing it with tobacco meant it could be smoked. Previous to that, it was mixed usually with fluids, wine and so on, tinctures. And what you had was a fluid form, not nearly as addictive or as powerful. But the Dutch began in Java. They brought the custom to Taiwan, and then from Taiwan it moved to the coastal provinces of China. And by the early 1800s, it was pretty well widespread in China, even though it was banned. An English missionary said this in 1829, "These two terrible trades, opium and slavery, were the great moral crimes of the age. No matter how abhorrent in the eyes of God, even the most respectable of Britain's trading houses did not hesitate to engage in either." So it was not simply a matter of Chinese smuggling, but it was mainly smuggled in by the British, and after a certain period of time by the United States as well. So the foreigners were responsible. The emperor in 1813 expressed alarm. "Those who smoke it can suddenly become excited and capable of doing whatever they want without restraint. Before long it will steal their life and kill them." So he understood what the problems were, but once it got started, and the British, of course, this was the source of that was the mainstay of their trade, even though it was illegal, there had to be a lot of official collusion. But by 1830, there was an official report, there are opium smokers everywhere, especially in the government offices. From the government general all the way down through the ranks of officials, the ones who do not smoke opium are very few indeed. So the emperor sent for reports on the opium trade, and they told him opium is flooding into the interior, the multitude of users expands day by day, and there are more people who sell it. They are like fire and smoke, destroying our resources and harming our people. Each day is worse than the last. So it had become something of a plague. The Americans and the British apparently didn't really think that there was anything wrong with the smuggling. Amasa Delano. I do not pretend to justify the prosecution of the opium trade, but as a merchant, I insist that it has been a fair, honorable, and legitimate trade, equivalent to importing brandy into the United States. So that was it. They did know that slave trade was often coupled with the opium trade. In other words, the two were, if they were going to be denounced, they were denounced together. Well, eventually, as you know, I think I mentioned last time, the Chinese appointed a commissioner to see what could be done. The smuggling all came in from Canton. It was the only port that was open to the Europeans. So it was all done in Canton. Appointed Commissioner Lin. He has become a real hero in China, as you can imagine. His birthday is celebrated in Taiwan. I told you there's a statue in Chinatown, pioneer in the war against drugs. And he decided to come in and take a very strict line. He was going to deal with this problem once and for all. Incidentally, most of the Chinese officials believed that he brought disaster on them. So they were not, in retrospect, they weren't approving this strict line. But nevertheless, he blew into town, Canton, and he said, "I'm going to change this." And he seized the opium because it was, being traded openly. He did not understand that the British had a fleet with ships nearby that were far superior to anything that the Chinese could produce, and that the fleet could sail right up to Canton and open up with its guns and blow the city to Kingdom Come. Absolutely. The Chinese blame him now for bringing this fate on them because of his hard line. But nevertheless, in the summer of 1839, before the British fleet arrived, he destroyed the opium. And in the Times of London, June 11th, 1840, for 20 years, all of the wealth that made England a rich country has come from its trade with China. Now that is all of the money that developed the American railway system, American cities, came from China. I don't know if you're aware of the extent of the Chinese influence on the American and the British economy. And products China sold to Britain, tea, silk, all beneficial. Britain could not exist a single day without them. Then Lee, this is his letter to Queen Victoria. By what principle of reason should these foreigners send in return a poisonous drug which involves in destruction those very natives of China? So he took a very hard line, and you know that he destroyed the opium, the fleet came up to Canton, opened its big guns. This, after all, was the that had destroyed the great Napoleon. Nevertheless, the Chinese immediately asked for terms. It's interesting that opium was legal in England at the time. In fact, the greatest poem, one of the greatest poems, I'll have to qualify it, in the English language was the result of an opium dream. Do you know which I'm speaking of?
Coleridge.
Must be an English major here.
Coleridge.
What is it?
Coleridge.
I can't hear you.
Coleridge.
Yes, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Kublai Khan. When he was under the influence, a lot of people in England took opium because liquor was too expensive. Opium was very, very cheap. And so they resorted to opium rather than, especially working people. It couldn't afford rum. But anyhow, Coleridge's Kublai Khan, do you all know the poem? It set him, once he took the opium, he had an opium dream, and he said he composed Kublai Khan in a sort of reverie brought on by 2 grains of opium. Of course, it's one of the most famous poems in the English language. In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. Probably know the poem. The second most famous opium addict in England was Thomas de Quincy. Do you know him? I've got his book with me. Right, here it is. Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Wrote a book of his confessions. Mentioned that he ingested opium, and that I have a few lines from it. Oh, he purchased it from London druggists, and he was, I was informed by several cotton manufacturers that their work people were rapidly getting into the practice of opium eating, so much so that on a Saturday afternoon, the counters of the druggists were strewed with pills of 1, 2, or 3 grains in preparation for the known demand of the evening. So they had all the opium put out for them. The immediate occasion of this practice was the lowness of wages, which at the time would not allow them to indulge in ale or spirits. And wages rising, it may be thought that this practice would cease. But as I do not readily believe that any man, having once tasted the divine luxuries of opium, will afterwards descend to the gross and mortal enjoyments of tobacco, I take it for granted that those eat now who never ate before, and those who always ate now eat the more. There it is. So, anyhow, the it became widely popular, very widely popular. Opium, I mean. But the war was never popular in England.
I have a question. How come they didn't try to grow it in India, or maybe they did, and the other Southeast Asian countries?
Roll it into what?
Why didn't the British, who owned India basically, have opium coming from there as well, and not be so dependent on China?
Actually, they were importing it, the British imported it from, generally speaking, from India.
Right.
The trade was controlled by the British East India Company, which had a monopoly on the trade. It was linked to prosperity in India as well. Indian farmers cultivated opium. The British East India Company made a huge profit from it. The profit was what drove the trade. The British government was not involved in it. This was a private enterprise, as was the enterprise in the United States. But they did not try to stop it because they linked it with the continuing prosperity of their Indian possessions. So that was the connection there. The United States was a latecomer. Most of the opium that was brought to China came from Turkey. American vessels went to Turkey, picked up the Turkish opium, and they brought it in. But it was a very, very profitable trade. It's a weed that grows wild. All you have to do is pick it and bring it, you know. Anyhow, the war was very unpopular in England, excuse me. They understood what the potential problems were. Gladstone, who later became one of the great prime ministers in British history, I am in dread of the judgment of God upon England for our national iniquity toward China. The Chartists Rebellion, you know, it was a working man's rebellion. It was, they took up the limitation of the opium trade as one of their key measures. The newspapers in London were all against it. This is the Times of London, March 1840, when the war had begun. The war is nothing less than an attempt by open violence to force upon a foreign country the purchase of a deadly poison prohibited by its laws. The Leeds Mercury, as regards morality and humanity, the opium merchants are the pitiless agents of as cruel and detestable system as was ever contrived to effect the ruin and misery of men. There were attempts in Parliament to halt the war by forcing the resignation of the cabinet. On April 7th of 1840, James Graham, he was a conservative leader, stood up and described the greatness of China and asked why England was contributing to her fall. Petitions rolled in from all over England and Scotland, religious groups, temperance societies. They said that the purpose of the war, the sole purpose, is to advance the interests of drug dealers. This stands out in history as the blackest stain on the character of Great Britain. The Spectator, no matter how the government ministers may try to paint it as a respectable war, do what they can, gloss over it as they may, the Opium War is the name by which history will hand it down. All kinds of... Now, what about the United States? We were involved in the trade, but not in the war. It was extremely unpopular in the United States as well. The only major figure who endorsed it was John Quincy Adams, formerly president. The cause of the war, he said, is not the opium, it is the koto, the refusal of the Chinese to engage on an equal level with other countries. That's the cause of it. We can't have access to the government. We're restricted to one port on the southern coast and no equal opportunities. Opium is no more the cause of the war than the tea thrown overboard into Boston Harbor had caused the American Revolution. Maybe he made a point. He said it was the opium smuggling is a mere incident. The Chinese, in all of their intercourse with other nations, political or otherwise, their superiority must be acknowledged and manifested in humiliating terms. William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, decried it, said that he wished the Chinese success. He wished them prosperity. He decried the issue. It was just like the slavery issue in the U.S. And finally, to sum up, this is a story of a little girl in Boston in 1841, as reported in a Boston paper. And she asked her father, "The English won't come here, will they, father, and kill us if we don't buy their opium and eat it?" Father says no. Both agree. The British should have sent their soldiers to China to arrest the wicked men who sold the naughty opium, rather than to kill the Chinese and burn down their houses and kill their cattle and their gardens and their fields of fruit and grain. And then the little girl says she wouldn't like Queen Victoria so much anymore. They say she has a little girl. I wonder how she would like to have it eat opium and be killed by it. That kind of sums it up. You know, at the end of the war, we did not participate. At the end of the war, the Chinese...
You had a question?
The question, I'm sorry.
As I'm listening, John Quincy Adams, to me, had the answer.
John Quincy Adams had what?
The answer. Essentially, what you've described is a kingdom that is so stable that it is unable to adjust to change. And it did not recognize the danger from the outside.
Right.
And, you know, we all want stability, but I take a look at the United States, where people come from all over, and they fight like crazy at home, but here they tend to get along. The other countries of the world have always been so stable. Now they're having trouble with all this immigration.
Yeah, what he's really saying is that in the emerging world of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Chinese are still pursuing a path that they pursued 1,000 years earlier. They can't continue to do that. They don't understand that they can't continue to do that. But the new world is upon them. For up to maybe 1720, 1750, let's say, the Chinese were secure. The system went on from emperor to emperor. When times got bad, for example, times always got bad. When times were good, the population rose. When the population rose, there was pressure on the land and famine broke out. Then there was a revolution, but the revolution was such that the sitting emperor would be the dynasty would be replaced by a different dynasty. And the new dynasty, such was the power of the Confucian state, in a little while, even the Mongols, the wild Mongols of legend, who sacked Central Asia, moved into Russia and so on, even they became Chinese. They took a Chinese title. Kublai Khan ruled as a Chinese emperor, revived the tributary system, the koto, the examination system, which lay at the root of it all. Confucius was the source of all wisdom. He was pretty wise, I will say that. He was, you read his thoughts and you agree. But the examination system went back into place. The tributary states, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, came to pay tribute. The whole thing went back as it had been. There were cycles. And even barbarians adhered to the cycle. But the one impregnable source of it was that China was at the center. China was number one. They didn't care about the Europeans, and it's true. If you go back to the 16th, 17th century, China was the most powerful state, the most advanced state in the world.
Also,
It was the Chinese trade.
but the least adaptable.
But what began,
It was not
but what
acceptable.
happened, no, what happened was the rest of the world began to pull ahead. The Chinese did not understand that by the 18th century, industrialization, mechanization, the growth of new movements, democratization, the Europeans had begun to pull ahead. And in China, there was no impulse to keep up with them because everything's perfect. You know, we have the answer. We're not a nation among nations. We are the Central Kingdom. We are the middle empire. We stand between heaven and mankind. We have Confucius. We have the great philosophers. We have the great inventions. Chinese invented, you know, in the 2nd century they were printing and so on. They just could not acknowledge. And even through the war, and incidentally, the Europeans followed up with the second opium. They're called the Opium Wars because this only opened the door halfway. The Chinese permitted them to open another 4 or 5 cities. So it wasn't just Canton, now they could trade at 4 or 5 cities. But they still wouldn't let them come to the court. They still would not permit free movement. It was a halfway, because the Chinese really didn't think this was an important war. They were involved in internal rebellion all through the 19th century. That was what, in fact, they thought so little of these conflicts with the Europeans, which were confined mainly to the coast. This is a prize-winning book that appeared last year, Imperial Twilight, The Opium War and the End of China's Last Golden Age, Stephen Platt. And this is one of his conclusions, I thought. As I said, the Chinese eventually had to legalize it. Chinese farmers learned to plant opium poppies. The opium trade fell away because the Chinese were producing their own. And as you know, they're the source of most of the opium today coming in to the United States. However, he mentions that by the 20th century, the Chinese were themselves manufacturing 5 times what came in from the British and American smugglers. But this is what he writes as a conclusion. It was the English-speaking world that condemned it as the Opium War from the beginning, while Chinese writers through the 19th century simply referred to it as a foreign incident. To them, opium was a domestic problem, and the war was a minor affair in the grand scheme of China's military history. Only after the fall of the dynasty in 1912 did historians in China begin to call this war the Opium War in Chinese. And only in the 1920s would Republican propagandists finally transform it into its current incarnation as the bedrock of Chinese nationalism. The war in which Britain forced opium down China's throat, the shattering start to China's century of victimhood, the fuel of vengeance for building a new Chinese future in the face of Western imperialism. Year 0 of the modern age. And that's exactly, and only in retrospect did it become a, Chinese had bigger problems. Incidentally, there was a second set of battles. Between 1842 and 1857 or 58, was constant struggle between the Europeans who were attempting to gain further and further footholds and the Chinese who were trying to deny it to them. But the Chinese had bigger problems, massive rebellions, domestic problems, far more important than the European pests on the coast. They were struggling with a rebellion. First, began in about 1780. It was called the White Lotus Rebellion. And then later, the Taiping Rebellion, which is the most, I guess, expensive in terms of life rebellion in all of human history. The population of China in the beginning of the century was 410 million. At the end of the century, it was 350 million. The deaths all came in internal rebellion. The dynasty was reaching its conclusion. Every great dynasty in Chinese history has gone through phases, and toward the end, it becomes corrupt. That's what happens in any system, any government. Corruption is almost inevitable. And the Manchu government became detached from the population. They became too fond of luxury and of, in fact, some of them fell victim to opium. They became detached. They didn't pay the soldiers. The soldiers rebelled. The peasants were insecure in the countryside. Not enough food was produced to feed a growing population. So all through the 19th century, what you have in China is the foreigners who are a problem, but as someone put it, a disease of the skin. They'll go away one day. We can put up with them. And the internal rebellions. First, the White Lotus at the beginning of the century was mainly a rebellion of Buddhists and Taoists. These were minority religions in China, especially in the South, who, in a sense, were repressed by the omniscience of Confucianism. The examinations were based on mastery of Confucian ideas. The whole hierarchy of Mandarin government was based on Confucianism. That was the official, it's not a religion really, it's an ethical system. But there were always pockets of Buddhists and Taoists. The Taoist philosophy, do nothing, everything will come right of itself. I used to have a lot of students who believed it. Didn't know they were Taoists. So this was a revolt that began in the late 18th century and continued into the 19th. I told you it flared up again in 1811 because of the Great Comet. You know, there was a worldwide comet. In Russia, it was seen as a harbinger of disaster, and it really did anticipate Napoleon's invasion. In the United States, there were earthquakes in several Midwestern states, and when they saw the comet, that again was a sign the dynasty was dying. Well, it took a lot of lives. The Chinese had a surplus in the treasury in 1800. By 1815, the surplus was gone. They were now in debt. It was gone fighting the rebellion. And then, in the mid-century, the Taiping Rebellion, the largest revolt in human history. It was extraordinary. It lasted for 14 years, began in 1851, ended about 1864. And I think I mentioned it last time. It was really, it grew out of the brain of a psychotic young man named Hong Hu Chuan, who failed the second level exam 4 times. Must have had a breakdown. Decided that he would visit an American Baptist minister, a brimstone and fire type of minister. Some of the ministers who went to China, the 5 cities that were now open, they were medical missionaries. You know, they coupled medical help. But this one was a product of the Great Awakening in the United States. You know, ready to baptize the heathen and so on and so forth. Well, apparently, Hong visited him and stayed with him for a month. Issachar Roberts, and was introduced to the Bible, Old and New Testament. Apparently suffered some kind of a breakdown. I'll try to shorten this because it's a very important, long story, but I want to get to our relations, U.S. relations with China through this period. And apparently suffered some kind of breakdown, had all kinds of visions, and decided at the end that he was the younger brother of Jesus. He saw God, he's an old man, if you're interested, with yellow hair, sitting on a throne. And right by his side was Jesus, who was middle-aged by this time. And then on the other side, nobody. And so Hong Hu Chuan decided he was the younger brother of Jesus, and he was given a sword by God and said, go and exterminate the heathen in my name. Well, he took it literally. Wouldn't have worked unless there was a crisis, a landowning crisis, a crisis in the government, a period of floods, I guess loss of prestige because of the losses to the Europeans. But nevertheless, he gathered followers. They called themselves the followers of the Great Peace, the Taiping Rebellion. And they apparently began to gather similarly disillusioned peasants mainly. He preached a brand of Christianity that would be very difficult for anyone to recognize, but they instituted all kinds of reforms in the territory that they conquered. This rebellion went on for almost 14 years. As I said, it's contemporaneous with the Civil War in the United States, same period. And various foreign missionaries met them and were astonished by their knowledge of the Bible, both the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. They instituted a lot of reforms. Women became equal. They ended customs like foot binding and so on. They attempted, all men are brothers. They attempted to make this not a rebellion, but a true revolution. Well, what would the foreigners do? Because they had established a capital in Nanking on the Yangtze. They had taken all the cities of the Yangtze. They were the greatest threat to the Jing dynasty that had ever appeared in all its several hundred years of life. So what would happen? Well, the Europeans now considered what their options were. These are so-called Christians. Shouldn't we favor them? After all, they know the Bible. They're against foot binding. They have declared war on a lot of the customs that Christians decried, no drugs and so on. So shouldn't we perhaps be sympathetic to them? Then on the other hand, in 1857 and 58, a Second Opium War had arisen. The Europeans were not happy with the first settlement. What the first settlement involved was 5 cities and no residents in Beijing. They wanted more than that. The trade was increasing. They wanted extraterritoriality. They didn't want their citizens to be tried by Chinese rules. They wanted them to be tried by European law, all kinds. And so the British and the French had collaborated in the Crimean War against Russia. It was just over. So they decided, they put together a list of grievances, claimed the Chinese had fired on a French ship called the Arrow, and they decided now or never. They would send troops to the capital itself. They would invade the capital. They would meet the emperor face to face, and they would tell him what was what. This was the proper time to do it. This is called the Second Opium War. What they wanted was more cities opened, representation in Beijing, their own law followed, and they wanted they wanted their ships to be able to sail on Chinese rivers, undisturbed. They had a list, well, the Chinese are now, the dynasty is in the midst of this terrible rebellion, constant fighting, all the cities of the Yangtze conquered by the Taipings, completely vulnerable now. What was more important, to fight the Taipings or the Europeans? The Taipings came out on. So when they stalled a little bit, a joint British and French force entered the city of Beijing, and what they did was to burn down the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City was in the center of Beijing. It was a marvelous park filled with buildings that had been created by the finest of Chinese architects through the ages. And they would teach them a lesson. They would burn down the city, which they did. Now you know who's boss. Well, the Chinese decided they had to go along with them. They opened up 10 more cities. Sure, send your representatives to Beijing. We knew you were barbarians. We always thought you were barbarians. You burned down the treasure of the ages. You've confirmed the fact that you're barbarians. So this is really the opening in 1858, the Second Opium War. Now the Europeans had a stake in the rebellion. They now knew that they had to perpetuate the dynasty, because if the Taipings won, the Taipings would maybe cancel all the treaties. And so they now begin to send guns and modern munitions to the Chinese government in its fight with the Taipings. And several very interesting figures, volunteers from Europe, soldiers of fortune. Frederick Townsend Ward, he was an American. He came to China looking for adventure, and he decided he'd throw his lot in with the Chinese army and help to put down the Taipings. He was killed in battle, as a matter of fact. His place was taken by a British adventurer named Charles Gordon, later to be known in history as Chinese Gordon, because he had assisted in the war against the Taipings. Chinese Gordon became very famous in England because of his exploits in China. And later, when the British faced a rebellion in East Africa, they decided to, it was there was a rebellion, the Mahdi, this was another attempt to create a Muslim state in East Africa, in what's today the Sudan. They didn't want to commit troops, so they sent him. They sent him, and you lead the defense, but there's no army. Well, you did it in China, you can do it again. Of course, you know what happened to him, because there was a movie made about it. What was the name of the movie? Do you recall?
Cartoon.
Right. They sent him in with no army, so of course the rebels seized Khartoum and they decapitated him. Later exhibited his head all over East Africa, but that's another story, okay? All right, so now here we are. It's now, let's say 1860. 1865. The Taiping Rebellion is done. 30 million at least dead because of the Taiping Rebellion. The armies lived off the land. Peasant livelihood destroyed. The Europeans in Beijing, the Europeans throughout the country, the sale of opium zooming, the Chinese not even, so what you see is the death knell of the dynasty. It's going to struggle on till 1912, but by 1860 it's really pretty much finished. Now, what's the role, do I have time? What is the role of the United States in all these doings? So let me see if I can zero in on that. Aside from Dr. Roberts, the Baptist minister, fueling this rebellion that took 30 million lives, but aside from that, let's see what the United States was up to. First of all, we were parasites. We hopped on the backs of the British. So, as soon as the Opium War was over, the British had opened 5 more ports, etc., the United States decided we would send an ambassador. Well, it wasn't an ambassador, but we would send somebody, an official, to Canton in 1843 to sign a treaty with the Chinese. We wanted everything the British got. You can't deny us. If the British have 5 ports, we want to trade in those ports. We don't want to get left out. So they sent in 1843 an ambassador named Caleb Cushing, and he signed a treaty with the Chinese. Daniel Webster was Secretary of State, and John Tyler, I believe, was president. So they sent Caleb Cushing, an American diplomat, to sign a treaty. And he was given instructions. All pains should be taken to avoid the giving of offense and the wounding of the national pride of the Chinese. But at the same time, you will be careful to do nothing which may seem to imply any inferiority on the part of your government. In other words, don't do any kotos, but make sure that if the British have 5 ports, we want in. That was the essential part of it. They sent a letter to the emperor, 1843. Dear Emperor, I hope your health is good. China is a great empire extending over a great part of the world. The Chinese are numerous. You have millions and millions of subjects. We have 26 states, and so they named all 26. We hope for peaceful trade. Signed, your good friend John Tyler, President of the United States. Well, they apparently everything the British got, we want to make sure that we pledge to you that we will not deal in the opium trade. Americans are different from the British. British bad, Americans good, right? That was the essential message. Impress upon the Chinese, question, that one great object of your visit is to prevent and punish the smuggling of opium into China. We had been smuggling it into the British. We won't ever do that. Make sure he knows that we're a powerful country, and make sure you don't do any kowtow, but we are a powerful country, and we want in for all the concessions that the British get. Okay, well, he went over, and they signed the Cushing Treaty. So that was the first formal treaty we had with the Chinese, 1843. In 1853, we sent over a West Pointer as ambassador, minister. Humphrey Marshall, his name was, a West Pointer. And he spent a couple of years in China during the Taiping Rebellion. And his conclusion was, the rebels have no idea of how government works. Neither does the government. The people are indifferent. The people only think of who will be our masters. He was not very much impressed. And he was High Commissioner from 1853 to 54. But he did predict this. China is like a lamb before the shearers. As easy as conquest are with the provinces of India. Any interference by the U.S. to quiet and tranquilize China would be a work of humanity and charity. They're in trouble and they need help. They need our help. We're not the British. We didn't smuggle opium. Our hands are clean. Impress that on them. In 1861, during our Civil War, and they're in the midst of the Taiping Rebellion at the same time. They're having a civil war at the same time. Lincoln appointed a minister to China his name is Anson Burlingame. He's the most successful of all. He works against the Taipings. He works with the British and the Russians and the French to strengthen the government against the Taipings. They know what they have with the government. They don't know what they would have with the Taipings. And he actually, 1868, he negotiates a formal treaty with the Chinese called the Chinese-American Treaty that opened the way for large-scale immigration of Chinese laborers to the United States. It was 1868. The Civil War was over. California was empty. It was just being settled. California, Oregon, Washington, they needed labor. And much of the Chinese labor came from the Canton area because they had been familiar with Europeans. Some people knew English. They had been in contact with Europeans for the longest time. So a lot of the labor would come. So the Burlingame Treaty arranged for Chinese labor, no numbers, to come into the United States. When he retired in 1868, or 67, he was there for about 5 or 6 years, the Chinese asked him, would he lead a delegation of Chinese, the Chinese government, to America and to Europe to arrive at some kind of a relationship outside of the problems of the past. They would send all their dignitaries. They would go to Washington, they would go to London, but they wanted Burlingame, that's how popular he was with the Chinese, to lead the delegation. And he agreed. So sure enough, in April of 1868, the delegation led by Anson Burlingame, ex-ambassador or minister, arrives in San Francisco. They travel from San Francisco to Boston. Then they go to New York and to Washington to meet Andrew Johnson, who is in the throes of an impeachment, as you know. They get to Boston. They're met by a marching band. 162 horse-driven carriages, 400 mounted police, an American flag and a Chinese flag. It's a yellow flag with a yellow streamer flag is displayed together. 5,000 people come to the port to greet the Chinese. Oliver Wendell Holmes is there, and he writes a poem for the occasion. Open wide ye gates of gold, to the dragon's banner fold. Builders of the mighty wall, bid your mountain barriers fall. So may the girdle of the sun bind the east and west as one. Nice, right? In June 1868, they go to the White House. They meet Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson compares the early years of the American Republic with the current crisis in China. There's a state dinner. There's a big reception thrown by General Grant. Then they go to New York. A big dinner at Delmonico's restaurant. Emerson greets them. Another poem. This is what the Toastmaster at the dinner says. There is no spot on earth where there has been greater progress made within the past 5 years than in the Empire of China. Let her develop herself at her own time and in her own way, and that silver which has been flowing for hundreds of years into China will come out into the affairs of men. Predicted also that soon Protestant ministers would be invited in to plant the shining cross on every hill and in every valley. Emerson hailed the union of the farthest east and the farthest west. Lavished praise on China. You invented gunfire and the printing press, paper. Emerson was 65 years old. He mentioned how intrigued he was by Confucian philosophy. Confucius' insistence that mankind could achieve perfection by self-cultivation. He labeled Confucius one of the world's 13 greatest thinkers. Well, it was all love and everybody was happy, everything was going well. It's very interesting that it really opened the way for Chinese to begin entering the United States, but there was one Chinese member of the delegation. His name was Ji Jiang. And just let me read what his impressions of America were before I finish. He was an official, Chinese official. He reported on U.S. shipbuilding, steel mills, microscopes, printing presses. Western technology is the key to China's regaining its glory, he said. He praised the U.S. Christianity, but he noted that in the United States, the love of God is less real than the love of profit. 1868. Visited Washington's tombs, all love and happiness. And unfortunately, Burlingame accompanied them to Europe, but died in Russia. So it was the end of the mission. But it just gives you some idea. The United States had a distinctive relationship with China. It was somewhat different from that of the Europeans, and we emphasize the difference. Okay, I'll continue. I'll start with the boxers next week. Thank you for your